All right, what's going on, everyone? I came across an article about information warfare and what the United States needs to do better to potentially counter China and Russia going forward. Thought it was worth sharing and getting into. I posted it on the community page of the channel. The link is there, but also put the link in the video description here if you want to check it out. So it was published on October 19th from the West Point Modern War Institute, titled Homeland Defense in the Information Space, Learning from Russian Influence Campaigns in Eastern Europe. Now, this article primarily talks information warfare as opposed to, which is a very broad term that encompasses things like misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. And I personally I like to stay up there with the broader term. I think those other more specific terms have been kind of watered down. They're used so frequently that at this point they don't necessarily mean what we think they mean. So information warfare, primarily what's being used here, and I think I like that term, personal preference, but let's go ahead and dive in. A couple items I wanted to call out here. Right here, really this whole paragraph. Russia and increasingly China, as well as other adversarial countries like Iran and North Korea, see tremendous value in pursuing cheap, low-risk influence operations via the internet and social media. Pushing conspiracies upon unsuspecting citizens, especially in Eastern Europe, creates an alternative reality, which is weaponized to the benefit of Russia and others. Social media warriors working on behalf of Beijing and Moscow generate false and misleading information about various events to sow division along socio-political lines, which creates and amplifies grievances by further polarizing societies. Not really any of a shocker there. I don't think we kind of knew that already, but I thought it was interesting just to put it out in print. It's not just talking about pro-Russia, pro-China, anti-US, anti-NATO. There's a deliberate piece in especially Russia's playbook that is designed to sow division on a topic that might have absolutely nothing to do with Russia and absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine, but more our internal dynamics. And often that comes back to politics. And I think we've probably seen that a little bit, or I think it's reasonable to assume we have seen some of that play out. Now, in terms of capabilities to push this information around the internet, I thought this was concerning, I'll say here, but also not shocking. China has roughly 1 million personnel dedicated to conducting information operations. The United States has about 30,000. Clearly, China can conduct information influence campaigns against other countries, particularly in the cyber domain, with a level of intensity, scale, depth, and breadth that the United States and its allies and partners cannot match. Not crazy to hear that China has, especially the manpower resources, to put into something like that. I don't know that this is entirely a numbers game, but that's crazy. 30,000 does seem a little bit on the low side. It'd be interesting to see exactly how those people are labeled, right? I don't think they go to work at the Information Warfare Department, and there's a lot of different aspects to what that looks like. And I've seen some comments talking about, we need to include things like Hollywood or major media sources or just Americans talking on the internet as a part of that information operation, because at the end of the day, it's a source of information. So there's no way that 30,000 includes that whole number, but, look at NBC, for instance, to just grab one out of the hat. They're not putting out the targeted, concentrated information warfare information that you would see coming out of some of these areas in China. So it's not a direct one-to-one, but I do think it's interesting to think about how broad you potentially could throw that net. Another one here, and this is where I was saying earlier I like the term information warfare as opposed to disinformation, misinformation, and so on. Right here, for instance, during the U.S.-led pullout of Afghanistan in 2001, Moscow touted narratives about how the United States and NATO would abandon Ukraine in the next crisis. That's not really misinformation, malinformation. It doesn't really fit any of those categories because we did leave Afghanistan. We have a history of that in the United States, not sticking around, whether you want to go to Vietnam or before the Iraq War with the Kurds. We do leave these areas. We tend to not stay for very long. So for Russia to use that as an example of how we're not going to stick it out with Ukraine, it's not incorrect information. It's an assumption. It's an analysis, but it's not inaccurate, right? So it's a lot of times we label things, anything coming out of Russia, as deceitful and as a lie. Same with China. But I thought that was a great example of using factual information to draw a conclusion that wasn't crazy to get to, right? And then the article goes on to say that those channels talking about that were really pushed throughout Ukraine leading up to the 2022 invasion. Now, jumping back to the article on that topic of the invasion, I thought this was funny. I don't know if funny is the right word. Once the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, Russian dismiss and malinformation campaigns shifted from COVID-19 and anti-NATO propaganda against the West to supporting the war efforts in Ukraine. I think I saw that. I wasn't like dialed into the COVID-19 stuff, but it does seem like when the war kicked off, much of the focus, much of the news attention went from that, just fell off and started talking Ukraine. And so how much of that was a part of these influence operations, these information operations, really hammering that point home? Just interesting to see that, right? I don't know how much that actually played into it. But a little bit further down, some of the countries in Eastern Europe mentioned a bot holiday. They said things that had been getting hammered on social media for months just kind of stopped. We were just talking about the COVID-19, and I've seen a lot of jokes about that too, where people saying, where did COVID go after the war started? So I don't know if this, if it was playing in tandem with it, how much of a root cause it is versus just kind of, parallel. As obviously the war in Ukraine was a major geopolitical event, still is, and has a lot of people concerned. So I don't know that I can 100% say the drop in coverage is due to these bot farms, but I thought it was interesting. Moving down a little bit further here, there was a lot of talk about what the United States could do. And I think it's worth getting into. Short and long-term focus in the West, they say generally. I'm not super confident about this. It doesn't leave me feeling like we're on the right track, just because this seems very pie-in-the-sky, idealistic, but worth getting into. That the authors were kind enough to offer solutions, so got to call them out. First, it requires politicians on the left and right. Let me highlight it here so you can see it. On the left and right, to avoid destructive domestic political discourse and conspiracy theories that are created and amplified by social media warriors and bots working on behalf of Beijing and Moscow. I like that they're using the term social media warriors as like a real term now. That's great. I've always kind of seen that as almost like a slur. Second, civic education and digital literacy should become codified as a pillar of U.S. national security and encouraged among NATO allies. I mean, those first two, I'm not very confident in either one of those. It'd be great if we avoided destructive domestic political discourse. I don't see that stopping anytime soon, unfortunately. And digital literacy, holy cow. Like, how do you tackle that one? The amount of times I've been sent video game footage from this conflict or footage from an old conflict that's just been kind of masked over and presented as something that's happened in Ukraine, that is so hard and such a broad thing to try to tackle, but got it, good on them, they're calling it out, it would definitely help. Third, U.S. leaders should consider the ways that Ukraine's strategic communications and Ministry of Digital Transformation have enabled it to sustain internal and external support for repelling Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This has kind of been in and out of the news, but I do think Ukraine deserves some credit for how they have operated in the information space. They are a powerhouse right now, able to not just counter but preempt a lot of Russia's information that's coming out of the conflict or being presented in Russia. No matter how you view the conflict, I think it's very worthwhile studying what Ukraine has done for our own purposes here in the United States. And the last one here, finally, if using the current model of Ukrainian success against Russia, the United States should be identifying opportunities for empowering and encourage organic counter-influence operations against China and Russia. I think that's going to be, honestly, just as hard. The third one seems the easiest. Study what Ukraine is doing, focus on what they did in the information space. First and second don't seem super optimistic. And I think this final point, encouraging organic counter-influence operations against China and Russia, I think that doesn't sit well with most Americans. I think that starts to dabble in U.S. pushing propaganda, the term of U.S. pushing propaganda or government talking points, right? I understand what they're getting at. It would be great if there was a huge organic swell of counter-influence operations against these adversaries, but that almost seems like something that has to happen, to use their term, organically rather than mandated by the government. But I'll go ahead and put a link to the article in the video description as mentioned. Give it a read. It's relatively short, and let me know what you think. But I think that'll do it for now. We'll see you next time.